could work that in more into the sermon this morning, but I obviously wasn't settled on it. I was leaning one way, leaning the other way. I feel like I'm settled now, but who knows? Maybe someone will give another argument. It's just hard with grammar. Grammar's tough. And but I think the fact that it's right there in the middle, I would assume Paul's singing this in his prison cell, trying. We endure, we'll reign. If we die with him, we will live with him. We deny him, I'm not going to deny him. You know what I'm saying? He's probably singing this in his own heart. I don't know how it would have sounded in Greek or whatever, but no doubt it was encouraging him to persevere. Okay, I'm ready to transition to the Renaissance. Are y'all ready to start this? Good then, I guess it's a majority. The Renaissance, okay. I enjoyed reading this. I got it earlier this morning, and I read this before I even got to church this morning. And, I only got like 5 or so pages that I actually, well, maybe more than that I want to cover. There's so much packed in here. And it takes me back. It reminds me of the things that I used to teach back at Augustine. I was given a section of literature to teach, and it was basically the Renaissance and the Reformation and the early modern period. And it's just bringing all this back to mind, so it's kind of exciting. So, the Renaissance. What is the Renaissance? This is a French term, and it simply means rebirth. That's what it means. That's what the word means. It means being reborn. When someone thinks about the Renaissance or Renaissance, sure I don't want to be French about, the French are probably like the Italians. They chew on the last syllable of every word. The Italians chew on the syllable. The French lose it in the nose. It's just there, stuck in the nostril every time. That's why I don't like the sound of French. But anyway, when you think about the Renaissance, what do you think about? You probably think about Donatello, Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Michelangelo, and these names ringing bells. You're like, yeah, those are the Ninja Turtles. They were named after people in the Renaissance. This is not Ninja Turtles. Okay?
Ninja Turtles is a pastor now, so.
Huh?
One of those Ninja Turtles is a pastor now.
Oh, really?
Jeff Durbin. You didn't know Jeff Durbin was a Ninja Turtle? No kidding.
Which one was it?
I'll keep up with this stuff.
I don't think I ever saw the Ninja Turtle.
I believe you, though. I bet Shredder's not. Anyway, okay, so, but the Renaissance it was a time period in culture, and it just came in at the right time. I mean, talking about the 100 Years' War, talking about the instability of the papacy, and people reading on their own, returning back to reading Greek and Roman sources, and it started to change the culture in a huge way. It was the forerunner of the Reformation. Before you get to the Reformation, things started to take place in all of Europe, and it prepared people for the Reformation. Okay? As the phrase goes, Erasmus, Desiderius Erasmus is the founder of Christian humanism, if you want to say it. He was a very important figure in the Renaissance. He laid the egg, and Luther hatched it. That's a famous saying. Erasmus laid the egg, and Luther hatched it. That's a pretty good saying. Erasmus and Luther did not really agree. Luther really took him to task on some things, but like it or not, Luther was dependent on him in many ways. And there are some really strong sayings from Martin Luther criticizing Erasmus. He would say that, I'm adjusting this, okay? Luther did not adjust anything. But he would say Erasmus serves feces on a golden plate. That's how he describes him. He was very well educated, but his content was not as great. So, anyway, this is the time period when that is preparing us for the Reformation. The Renaissance is a name that historians gave to this time period after the fact. It's not like they were walking around calling their own time period the established and they were growing. There was a whole university movement. Well, then it's through those universities culture change starts to happen. And it's interesting, it's actually still going on today through the universities. Culture change is happening. Well, what was it? Well, the core of it was this. It was a movement for a love of Greek and Roman, I'm going to say literature, and the way of life. We'll just say that. Okay? So people began to be fascinated with the old ways in which they were done. They looked back to Cicero, Seneca, Cato, at how they wrote and what they wrote about. And they wrote a lot, just so you know, they wrote a lot about virtue and ethics. Plato began to be reclaimed at this time rather than Aristotle. The Renaissance involved a revival of classical forms of thought. By classical, I mean Greek and Roman. The classics. When I say the classics, I don't mean what you read in English class. I mean classical forms of education going back to Greco-Roman world. That's what was obsessive in this time period. That's what people studied in universities. So they're forms of thought, their expressions, their actions. And so it began to have a focus on what does it mean to be human. And they looked back to Greek and Roman sources to understand, have humane studies. You probably understand this. You study the humanities even today. You study the humanities. If you're really studying the humanities, you're studying the Greek and Roman classical literature. You would read things like the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and Plato, and you would read Aristotle. You would also read Cato and Seneca and Aeschylus and all of these other classical forms of literature, and you're reading it with an eye to say, well, how do they understand humanity? How do they live their lives? Poetry, grammar, rhetoric, history, philosophy, all of this began to be reclaimed during the Renaissance. They would say things like, the idea is that nature gives you birth as a human, but the humane studies recreates us and makes us authentically human. You're born human, but it's when you begin to study. The idea of education was super important during the Renaissance, and this is what I think there needs to be a critique, obviously, of the Renaissance, but people began to see education as a means to becoming to the good life, and to becoming fully human. Like I can just educate you and make you more or better, good, noble, virtuous. We can do this through education. That's a problem. We got really, and actually it was, what was it? It was World War I that shattered that. It was either World War I or World War II. Maybe World War II. That shattered that idea. People were very well educated during that time period, and yet they can create the atom bomb. That's World War II. So, I think it was Karl Barth's commentary on the Book of Romans that landed like a bomb on the playground of the academics, is what people used to say. Is that, yeah, we didn't really fix the problem of humanity with education, did we? No, we actually have a deeper problem than a need to just simply be educated. Okay, but nonetheless, reclaiming of education. There was a term that was coined by a man named Neathammer, I guess. Neithammer? I don't know how to say this. I have an underline here. But during this time period, there was a growth of humanism. Now, some of you already know about humanism. Humanism is understood by this Latin phrase homo mensura, which means man is the measure. Humanism, I know that, I think Brad, you So they were Christian humanists. What this has become to mean today, though, is humanism is a philosophy that gets rid of Christianity, and humanity is the, well, it's a measure, it's the most exalted thing, period. The first form of humanism during the Renaissance was actually kind of Christian. Erasmus was a self-proclaimed Christian, and many others who wrote during this time period. They were very much pro-Christian. Their commitment to humanity and human culture was normally part of a Christian view of the world. So they saw they saw a God-given meaning and worth to this present life, which was different than the Middle Ages. Why? Because in the Middle Ages, they had a view toward eternity constantly. So they were focused on four things in the Middle Ages. And let me say these. They would fix their mind on death, judgment, hell, and heaven. Death, judgment, hell, and heaven, and this world is fleeting. And so you need to be focused on those things. So therefore, if you're focused on those things and the next life only, then you begin to say, well, who's the best people? It's the people that focus on those things most. Who are those people? Monks and nuns. Right? People who devote themselves to only thinking about other worldly matters, not human matters and human way of life on this side of eternity. Okay? So, the monk and the nun, they renounced the present world. They were poor, and they gave up family life and owning property. They subdued their bodies and their passions through ascetic labors. They would often practice asceticism, hurt the body, so that they could devote themselves to prayer and worship and scripture and attempt to become, quote, an angel in the flesh in anticipation of the resurrection, Luke chapter 20. So, the monk and the nun were highly valued during the Middle Ages. Well, when they returned to the Greek and Roman culture, they began to read about the value of human life here and virtue development here on earth. They began to say, well, wait a minute. Having property is not bad. Having a family is not bad. We don't have to pray all day. We can think about art. God made art. We can think about the beauty of the world around us. We can think about the beauty of even the human body. This is why when you look at some of the Renaissance paintings, you can see a shift. You see a shift from, like, take pictures or paintings of the Virgin Mary. Okay? Mary was almost during the Middle Ages exclusively painted as a woman that was like almost like the Queen of Heaven. She was the Queen of Heaven, that's how they understood. Angelic almost. But when you look at paintings of her in the Renaissance, they painted her much like a real earthly person. Just almost like someone you see in the marketplace. Which is actually closer probably to exactly what you're dealing with here. She probably had dirt on her face and underneath her fingernails because she's working all day. You know what I mean? Like, very normal person. And if you look at some of the sculptures and things like that, they get really detailed. Really detailed. The paintings get really detailed. The body, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but that's fine. Leonardo da Vinci was really big on this. I read some of his journals. But he would draw what things really look like. And so when you look at art in the Middle Ages, it's very flat. There's no contours hardly even to the face. It's just kind of flat. It's almost two-dimensional. But if you look during the Renaissance, it gets very three-dimensional. You can see literally veins on the arms. Because Da Vinci's sitting there drawing skulls and changed this. It shifted people's spiritual concern. Didn't lose it, but it shifted a lot of it to the this present life. But not usually denying life to come, but it's trying to accept both, trying to understand both. And if you go and you see some of the paintings, you can clearly see, like, I mean, he painted wonderful and beautiful spiritual things. It just looks incredibly real. It's not flat or two-dimensional. It's the way things are. Okay. So, Renaissance humanists begin to look back on the civilizations of Greek and Roman world as the golden age of human culture. Art, music, literature, education, science, government. All of this was studied. They began to glorify the secular realm of the state. So let's pause and think about that for a second. You remember that the papacy was in turmoil. And so where's the authority? Who's the ruling class? And, how can we get along in life? What's the institution that's responsible for helping us flourish? People began to shift attention away from the papacy toward the secular state, the worldly state. Perhaps these forms of government, the Greco-Roman forms of government, obviously they had a fair measure of flourishing. Perhaps we can start to look to government institutions and divorce them from the church and experience a sense of human flourishing. So, furthermore, they began to read pagan writers and try to draw from them truth. And that can get real dicey. The person that got a lot of attention was Plato. Scholasticism focused on Aristotle. When they started to rediscover Greek and Roman writers, they really emphasized Platonic philosophy. They thought Plato was, in some instances, certain people said Plato was inspired, which is wrong. He was not inspired, just so you know. There's only one thing that's inspired. That's God's word, right? But that's how they valued it. They looked and saw he was inspired. God must have given him revelation. Otherwise, he would have just said what he said. So, where did it all begin? I should mention this before I get to the exciting response. Let me mention this. The big phrase is in Latin, which is fun to know. Ad fontes was this. They wanted to return to the sources. That just simply means literally to the fountainheads. But you can translate it as back to the sources. Back to the sources. I don't have to take your word for it. I can go back and read the Greek New Testament, the early church fathers, myself. And I can see and study this myself. And so they did. And that's a huge, this kind of really prepared us for the Reformation. I think that idea. Ad fontes, back to the sources, because Luther took that seriously. I'm going to go read the Greek New Testament. And he did. And he was converted. And we'll get to that later. So, where did it all begin? It began in Italy. Italy is really the birthplace of the Renaissance. You had Italy divided into 5 political communities, and they were in different places. One was Milan, not Milan. It's spelled the same way. Milan. 2, Venice. 3, Florence. I've been there. It's amazing. It's really incredible. I will say that is my favorite place in Italy. I like it way better than Rome. It's incredibly beautiful. And let me tell you, the Renaissance is all over the place.
I was there too.
Did you go?
Yeah, remember
You see the golden doors?
the what?
The golden doors next to that big church, the Duomo?
Yes, yes.
The
And I
Medici
saw the
thing?
statues.
Yep,
All of those.
everywhere.
Yes.
Yep. No clothes on any. But they're pretty impressive. How did they do this, you know? Like, it's just, like, they were very talented.
We were there the same year, I think. I was there earlier, the same year that you were there.
My favorite, well, I mean, I was impressed with so many things, but the custom doors everywhere. They were old too. And then the Church of Dante was massive. You see that square? Anyway, we can talk about this all. We're not teaching it this way. Okay. Florence, Venice, Milan, Naples, and then you have the Papal States. Milan, Venice, Florence, Naples, and the Papal States. It was in the northern cities of Venice, Florence, and Milan that the dawn of the Italian Renaissance and humanism really started. It started in the north. Trade and commerce in the age of the Crusades, I know we're reaching back, had caused these communities to really get wealthy. Remember when the Crusades, and they're all trying to go the whole, a lot of times they're getting diverted, they're ending up in the northern places of Italy. Well, they're trading and they're doing some commerce. Well, this is causing the economy to develop. See, I told you that this builds, right? It's been building for a while. This book, I don't think will mention it, but there was also a development of a really well-developed banking system at the time. People began to trade and do commerce with people long distance from each other, and banks were established, which allowed commerce to grow immensely. So, lots happening. So they were very prosperous, and they became politically independent places. Venice, Naples, Florence. So since the 1200s, the old rural land-based way of life was dying out. These cities became metropolitan cities. Like, you go there to flourish and make money. You leave the rurus, which is Latin, like the country life. Okay, you go into the civilization, the hippies, the city. So they were thriving urban life and cultural development. So the first great, you might say that the man that, I guess, started it all, other than Erasmus, he was a Christian humanist. I'm going to erase this real quick. I'm sorry. At the top. First name we need to mention, really. I'll just give you the last name. All right, Petrarch. Anyone ever heard of Petrarch? Petrarch, it's a big name. Francisco Petrarch, 1304, 1374. His parents, natives of Florence, but he grew up in southern France. The reason why? He was there during the Avignon papacy, and the papacy fled from Rome and went to Avignon. He was there during that time. He served as a Catholic priest, and he didn't want that at all. He just kind of, I guess, ended up doing that. And he was really wicked. He had no sense of divine calling as a priest. He lived with several mistresses, had a number of illegitimate children, and was just wicked. But something happened to him in 1350. Petrarch experienced a life-changing religious conversion, which he described to his friend, whose name was, he was a writer, his name was Giovanni Boccaccio, and he says this, quote, "Once I loved that sickness of sexual immorality, but now I hate it so much more than I once loved it. When it arises in my memory, it overwhelms me with shame and horror. Jesus Christ set me free from it, and he knows that I'm speaking the truth. How frequently I prayed, weeping to him, and he has had compassion on me, given me his hand, and lifted me up to himself." Isn't that a great line? That's conversion. That's great. Jesus saved me from it. You know, his life is really similar to another guy in history that we've studied, who was a big name as well. St. Augustine. Remember how he lived his life. And it's no mistake, Petrarch. Everywhere Petrarch went, he carried with him a copy of Augustine's Confessions. He read all the time. Augustine was his favorite. He also began to, after his conversion and everything, and maybe before, but he read Latin writers, Cicero, Virgil, and Seneca. He modeled his writing style internationally famous. I've never read any of Petrarch's poems, but apparently he's really, really good. I did read this one time. It became so, during the Renaissance, it became so, lots of people were writing poetry. Everyone wanted to be a poet. And I do remember Petrarch writing something like, most of them should just quit because they're going to be broke and poor. Something like, I'm just summarizing it really quickly because it was like everyone wants to be a poet, they think that they're a poet, and most of them really sing. And you're probably not going to go anywhere. So anyway, he was really good. His spiritual hero was Augustine of Hippo. And since it was Augustine, because Augustine liked Plato, Petrarch also liked Plato. He began to be a Platonist. Petrarch's, he didn't like the way the Catholic Church favored Aristotle and scholasticism, so he went in the opposite direction. He was very much a humanist, and so humanists would go in the direction of Plato, they would go away from scholasticism, which had its roots in Aristotle. He thought, and among many, they thought that scholastic theology was just overcomplicated. It was too philosophical. It was too confusing. And so, and furthermore, they didn't like, and he didn't like this, he didn't like the medieval Latin. He wanted to read the original Latin. He thought it sounded better. It was vulgar, you know, Latin Bible of the Vulgate. That's what schoolmen usually study. And so he would study the scriptures, Greek, Hebrew. People began to study those in the original sources, but he favored the older forms of Latin. So he began to write like that. He began to favor the way Augustine wrote and what he wrote about, including his philosophy. So we see in Petrarch the ingredients, if you will, that went into Renaissance humanism, and I'm going to give you the 5 ingredients of Petrarch. He had an attitude of contempt for the medieval period. He was the first man to call the medieval period the Dark Ages. You've probably heard of the Dark Ages. That was Petrarch. Okay? He's like, I don't like that. I want to go further back than that. That's when it was the golden time. Cicero, all that. So, that's 1. He had a belief in the golden age of civilization in Greece and Rome. I should say, in the age of the apostles and the early church fathers. That's what they prized. People still do that today. People, even Christians today, they're like, oh, the early church. The early church was that was it. I would love to be a part of it. 2 things I want to say. You probably would hate being a part of the early church because there's so much persecution and it's very scary. But it would really test you. 2, you should realize they had lots of heresies going on. It wasn't perfect. Like no age of the church was perfect. So, anyway, 3 things. Or 3 of the 5. Number 3 of Petrarch's 5. He had a new fervor for Plato over Aristotle. 4, he admired the ancient Latin authors. And then 5, coloring all of this is the conviction that all philosophy and theology should revolve around humanity and human life, especially the relationship between human beings and God. So, with Petrarch, you have a revival of the Latin culture, a renewal for its enthusiasm. And alongside of that, there was also a revival for the Greek culture. This sprang up in Florence. And it came through a number of people. I'll give you one name here. This is hard to write. So, okay. This man was a native of Constantinople, and he began to lecture in Greek studies at the university in Florence. And he has inspired a whole new generation of people through education, again, university teacher. Also important is another man named Platon. He gave lectures in Florence, also on the philosophy of Plato. One of his most important works is on the difference between Plato and Aristotle, and it aimed at proving how much deeper and truer Plato's teaching was than Aristotle's. At this point, you get to where people began to favor Plato, I think, so much so that it was really bad. It kind of set in motion a trend that people are still doing today. They call themselves Christian Platonists. Even in seminary, even in the last year, I've been in seminary classes, people call themselves Christian Platonists. I don't think that's healthy. But in addition to Platon, he established a Platonic Academy in Florence where you can just simply study Platonic philosophy. The director of this was a man named Marsilio Ficino. He was a Catholic priest whose theology was rich, and he blended Christianity and Neoplatonism. That's when it gets really bad. You start blending Christianity with another philosophy, it's not going to be good. He even, Ficino, in his office, this is how bad Platonism got. He had a statue of the Virgin Mary there, which is expected for Roman Catholicism. And then he had a statue of Plato also right there next to her. And underneath he had like little burning candles, you know. It's almost like he just venerated these people, these statues. So that began to really take root during the Renaissance. Okay, another famous leader, or member of the Platonic Academy, and this is a big name, is Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. Say that 5 times fast. Okay? Studied Jewish mystical literature. He was a disciple of the religious reformer named Savonarola. Some of you know that name. He produced one of the most celebrated works of all during the Renaissance, and it was on the oration on the dignity of man. Now, I'm not going to read any of these, but just notice how these are focusing on Platonic philosophy, Latin writings, and man. Humanity. So, in this treatise, Mirandola maintained that God had placed humankind in the universe so that humans might study and investigate and understand everything it contains. I just want to say, good luck with that. I don't think he even realized how vast the universe is. It is mind-boggling what some of the physicists are finding even today. It's crazy. Human beings occupy the level of existence that lay midway between animals and angels in his mind. But towering kind of above them all, and this is really going to probably where I'm going to wrap this up, is a man named Lorenzo Valla. I really like this guy. I bet none of you know that name. Anybody know Valla? I know David probably does, so I think you've read this all already. This is interesting. If I could tell David about a book, he reads it and usually it's done in 1 week. It's really kind of intimidating. I think it was the last 2 books I suggested. I was like, how are you going to get that book? I already read that. Valla, 1406 to 1457, he was Roman. Okay? Ordained to the priesthood. He really loved Augustine. That's good. And one of the things that made him famous is he studied the Greek New Testament. He was so important to the Reformation. It's amazing how important he was to the Reformation, kind of in an indirect way. He studied the Greek New Testament. I want to study the New Testament, how it was originally written by the people that wrote it in the language that they wrote it. Why is that important? Because at this time, the Catholic Church had already declared that the Latin version of the Bible was the version. Let me explain this. There's actually a parallel in history. King James only. King James only. You know what I'm referring to, the King James only controversy. Some people are like, King James is the newly inspired translation he empowers it, and he has given us Latin and the Latin scriptures to study. I want you to understand this, that the King James Version of the Bible, for instance, originally was only based on 5 Greek manuscripts. 5. Today we have 6,000, over 6,000 Greek New Testament manuscripts. And your version that you have, your ESV and ASV, whatever, NLT, is based on that. I'll even tell you a quick side story. When Erasmus was compiling his original 5 Greek New Testament, he didn't have the last part of Revelation in the Greek. He couldn't find it. He didn't have it. And he had to really get it published really quickly because he was going to get in trouble. He was doing this without the Catholic Church permission. He was compiling his Textus Receptus, which is what the King James is based on. Erasmus is the original version. So he took the Latin and he said, well, this is what it'll look like in Greek. And he rewrote it in Greek. And he said, well, you don't do that, by the way. That's cheating. Okay? But anyway, this has happened before. They accepted the Latin version. Valla was like, I'm going to study the Greek. And he wrote 2 kind of books that were super important. One was annotations on the Greek New Testament. And that is extremely important, where he's commenting on the original versions of the New Testament. When you study the New Testament at the highest levels in seminary, for instance, you will have to take a Greek class. They'll give you buy a Greek New Testament, and you buy another little book, and it's a commentary on the Greek New Testament. So that when you get to a text that's a disputed text, there's a comment in it, in that commentary, and you go and you look at the different versions of it from the different manuscripts, and they rate it A, B, C, or D, which one's most reliable, and so on and so forth, and it gets really deep. That's called text criticism. Okay? Valla is like the founder of text criticism. He was really important for that kind of stuff. So, he also wrote another book that got him into quite a bit of trouble with the Catholic Church. This is wild, because he just studied and just did what he was supposed to do, right? As a student. And it was this: concerning the false credit and imminence of the donation of Constantine. Now, the donation of Constantine is a document. It states, I believe, that the Catholic, you can check me on this, that the Catholic Church has rights to certain lands. Is that right? Okay. That's what my memory says. If your memory says it, we're good. But the Catholic Church has rights to certain land. Valla started to research that document in the original source text, and he determined this document is a forgery. It's a fake. It is not real. So through text criticism, because that fake documents were in the ancient world. People even faked to be Paul when they would write letters. This is probably one of the reasons why Paul, at the end of some of his letters, see, I write this with my own hand. It's the way I sign all of my letters, basically. Like it's his proof of authentication. Okay? So, he proves that the donation of Constantine was a forgery. What does that mean? That means that they don't own what they say they own, legally. And if the Catholic Church doesn't own land, all of a sudden, what do they lose? Lots of power. So what happens? This is so ironic. I mean, Valla was supported by the papacy in his studies for a while. But he argued that the papacy should renounce all political power and become purely a spiritual institution. That right there got his writings like seized and condemned. Nicholas, the first Pope Nicholas V, was Lorenzo Valla's patron and supported him, but eventually they took his writings and said, no, we're not going to accept it. Why? Well, because the Catholic Church is losing power if you read them. It's so funny. They supported him in his studies, but his studies prove that the Catholic Church doesn't have the power that they claim to have. And then they say, we condemn your writings. This is not going to work. You're done. Isn't that great? But it doesn't stop there. see the line, you see the connection here? I mean, said this way, the Catholic Church supported the man who made the annotations of the Greek New Testament and then condemned him because of his studies. And then his studies made it to the hands of Erasmus of Rotterdam. And he, without the Catholic Church's permission, published his New Testament. And then that eventually made it into the hands of Martin Luther, who's reading it and is converted, and then there's the Reformation. You see that? You really can't stop, you can't make this stuff up, and you really can't stop this. I love it. I just love how all the pieces fit together. Okay. What else do I want to mention? Why don't we stop there? It's 5 minutes away. And we'll talk about the Renaissance and the rest of Europe. In Germany, right now we talked about it in Italy. We'll mention it in Germany and France and England. And then we'll talk a lot about Iraq. Any thoughts so far? You don't have to raise your hand. You certainly don't all have to speak at once. That's fine.
Michelangelo and Donatello.
So those are the Ninja Turtles that are pastors.
Jeff Durbin played both
It was
characters.
both of them?
At different points.
Oh, it's one character.
Yeah. And he said the pastor at Apologia or Apologia, the church.
There you go. Any idea on Shredder? No.
Throw in jail somewhat.
They're probably in jail. I used to love that stuff as a kid. I actually still don't like it. It's
During the collection of Ninja Turtles.
a collection of Ninja Turtles.
Adam did too. He was consumed by it when he was little.
I like how that's how we're ending our talk on the Renaissance. This is an appropriate
Ninja Turtles.
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Okay.
We'll wait on that one, okay?
Should we finish up with prayer?